Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we'll be doing more Testament of Hope, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are doing today an interview from Meet the Press that aired on television. Blurb reads, in this historic interview with the major leaders of the civil rights movement, we see clearly the power of August Meyer's description of Dr. King as a militant conservative. Sire and many other interpreters consistently consistently see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. outside the context of the Black church movement, unless we begin to see that the so-called paradoxes that seemingly plagued Dr. King's public career were really the paradoxes of a Christian leader trying to be righteous in an unrighteous world. We shall continue to minimize his intellectual and um, organizational brilliance. Um, Reflected in how he skillfully maintained a consistent Christian position throughout his public ministry. This skill is evident in this interview. He left the interview early because of a prior commitment to lead a demonstration in Chicago. In the remainder of the interview, the absence of his centrist leadership led to subtle ad hominem attacks traded between the old guard civil rights leaders, represented by Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young, and the Black Power advocates, represented by James H. Meredith, Floyd McKissick, and Stokely Carmichael. Reporters Roland Evans and Lawrence E. Spivak were particularly adept at accenting these schisms, despite the attempts of Carmichael and Roy Wilkins to mask the differences. Civil rights leaders in general tried to present a united front and tried to adhere to the principle outlined at one point by Carmichael. Privately, we have a right to analyze other civil rights groups, but we never do it publicly. This principle of unity and civility was often violated by all of the leaders of the civil rights movement in the heat of public debate and at the divisive prodding of the news media, but none of them adhered to this principle as religiously as Dr. King. In Where Do We Go From Here, 1967, Dr. King spoke poignantly to this issue. Too many Negro organizations are warring against each other with a claim to be absolute truth. The Pharaohs had a favorite and effective strategy to keep their slaves in bondage, keep them fighting among themselves. The divide and conquer technique has been a potential weapon in the arsenal of oppression, but when slaves unite, the Red Sea of history opens and the Egypts of slavery crumble. He added later that Negroes can differ and still unite around common goals. The differences between the old guard and the new militant leadership were quite evident just a few weeks before this interview took place. On the 6th of June 1966, there was an attempted assassination of James Meredith, who was leading a march against fear between Memphis, Tennessee, and Jackson, Mississippi. Shortly thereafter, Carmichael, King, McKissick, Wilkins, and Young met in Memphis in order to plan how to resume the march, and a vehement dispute took place between these factions. Wilkins and Young returned to their headquarters in New York, and Carmichael and McKissick remained under the condition that Dr. King would leave the march if they persisted in their advocacy of violence. Carmichael broke the pact before the march was concluded, remarking that Black Power, a slogan used by Allen Clayton Powell Jr. in his 1965 commencement address at Howard University, had become a national mood, if not a national movement, among many Black people. Meredith was released from the hospital later and was therefore able to participate in this nationally televised interview. Mr. Byrd of West Virginia, Mr. President, on Sunday, August the 21st, 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., SCLC, Mr. Roy Wilkins, NAACP, Mr. Whitney Young, National Urban League, Stokely Carmichael, SNCC, Mr. Floyd B. McKissick, CORE, and Mr. James H. Meredith appeared on Meet the Press, an NBC television and radio production. The moderator was Mr. Edwin Newman. The panel consisted of Mr. Lawrence E. Spivak, Mr. Roland Evans, Chicago Sun-Times and Publisher Syndicate, Mr. Carl Rowan, Chicago Daily News, Mr. James J. Kilpatrick, Richmond, Virginia News Leader, and Mr. Valeriani, NBC News. I ask unanimous consent to include the transcript of this special 90-minute edition of Meet the Press in the record at this point. There being no objection, the transcript was ordered to be printed in the record as follows. Moderator: Edwin Newman. Guests: Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., SCLC, Roy Wilkins, NAACP, Whitney Young, National Urban League, Stokely Carmichael, SNCC, Floyd B. McKissick, CORE, and James H. Meredith. Panel: Lawrence E. Spivak, Roland Evans, Chicago Sun-Times and Publisher Syndicate, Carl Rowan, Chicago Daily News, James J. Patrick, Richmond, Virginia News Leader, and Richard Valeriani, NBC News. Newman. This is Edwin Newman, inviting you to a special 90-minute edition of Meet the Press. Announcement. Today, in the special hour-and-a-half program of Meet the Press, focuses on the country's #1 domestic problem, civil rights. Our guests today are 6 of the nation's top Negro leaders in their first joint live broadcast. With us today in Chicago is the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., President and one of the founders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Dr. King, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, is a leading proponent of the principle of nonviolence. He's recognized throughout the world as a spiritual leader and in the civil rights movement in America. Because of the march he is heading today in Chicago, Dr. King finds it necessary to have the studio before the end of our program. Have necessary to leave the studio before the end of our program. For this reason, we will direct more important questions to him than to our other guest in the first part of our broadcast. And in our Washington studio, Roy Wilkins, a former newspaper man and an executive director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People since 1950, the NAACP, which is the heads of the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the country. Founded in 1909, it now claims a national membership of over 500,000. The first organization to use the picket line, it has been involved in many demonstrations and has played a major role in the fight for civil rights laws. Whitney M. Young Jr., Executive Director of the National Urban League since 1961, a former Dean of Atlanta University School of Social Work. He heads one of the most important biracial service organizations. Its policy has been to lead Negroes into the American mainstream through job training programs and through housing, welfare, and education projects. Floyd B. McKissick, National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality. He is a lawyer who gave up his practice early this year to become head of the 22-year-old Corps. Mr. McKissick's official biography describes him as a dynamic civil rights activist. He has played a leading role in picketings, sit-ins, and other civil rights demonstrations. His organization, CORE, claims a membership of 80,000 and is considered one of the most militant of the civil rights groups. Stokely Carmichael, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a graduate of Howard University and the youngest of the civil rights leaders. Mr. Carmichael heads the newest and most militant of the national organizations. His use of the slogan Black Power during a recent Mississippi march stirred up a storm in and out of the civil rights movement and brought him to front page prominence. And James H. Meredith, who occupies a special position in the American Negro movement because of his leadership in desegregating the University of Mississippi and in the recent march through Mississippi. He is now a student at the Columbia University Law School. Panel intro. We will begin the questions now with Mr. Spivak. Spivak. Dr. King, despite all of your marches and demonstrations and despite major civil rights laws, the civil rights crisis is getting worse rather than better. Or at least it seems so. Do you think it is growing worse? And if so, why? King, well, I think at points it is getting worse. This does not mean that we have not made significant progress, but I think the real problem today is there is still a tragic gulf between promise and fulfillment, and that the rising expectations of freedom and equality, the rising expectations of improvement, have met with little results. So the problem today is that we have laws on the books, but they have not been thoroughly implemented, and there are still pockets of resistance that are seeking to hold the civil rights movement back in our just and legal and moral aspirations for a democratic society. are still being met with these forces of resistance. Spivak. Mr. Wilkins, do you think the crisis is getting better or worse? Wilkins. I think only outwardly worse. We're having some manifestations of abrasive resistance, but actually progress is being made. We are going forward, and this despite the fact that great masses of people cannot count the difference in today's living between that they had, say, a year ago or 2 years ago. But the forces are in motion. I agree with Dr. King that they're not moving fast enough, but not on a broad enough scale. Spivak. Mr. Young, for many years we have had no civil rights laws of any importance. Very little was being done by the white community for the Negro population or with the Negro population, and yet we had relatively quiet. What is your explanation for the riots that are taking place at the present time? Young. Well, I think it reflects this high aspiration of the Negro. I never felt that social progress could be a painless process. I don't think that the good race relations is purely the absence of conflict. In fact, we probably have less disruption in South Africa today, where we have the greatest segregation and discrimination. I think that we are really facing today, and I think it's positive, and that is the white community is now coming to find out that it takes more than the passage of laws which relieve their guilt, and it takes actual determination to live with and to work with and to cooperate with Negro citizens. And it's this final confrontation that people find most difficult to make. Spivak. Mr. McKissick, what do you think? Do you think things are getting better or worse? McKissick. I'm of the opinion that things have not progressed tremendously for the masses of the people. I would not dispute the statement that some progress has been made, but I would say by and large, the average black man in the ghetto has not profited within the last 10 years. I think the last statistic showed, and I think even last week at the hearing in Washington here at the Ribicoff, when he made the statement, we'll find that we've got more discrimination in education, more segregated school systems. We find the unemployment rate is higher now than ever before. I think we could just go down the line and we could find that the situation has not improved as far as the masses are concerned. And that's what the Congress of Racial Equality is concerned with. Spivak. Mr. Carmichael, from your experience, are things getting better or worse? Carmichael. Well, I don't know if you could make a comparison like that. I believe that what is happening is that black people across the country are becoming politically aware of their position, of their strength, and of their ability to move. And based on that feeling, the masses of people are beginning to now move. And the question is whether or not the country is going to be able to meet their needs peacefully, or whether they'll have to move to disrupt this country in order to force the country to speak to their needs. Spivak, Mr. Meredith, may I hear from you on that? Do you think things are getting better or worse? Meredith, well, I think we've just reached a point in our history where we are really beginning to face the issue in question. And the question in this country is the basis, or what is going to be the basis of our society. Up until now, it's based on the theory of white superiority, and now this nation has to make decisions whether we will continue to use this base of white supremacy, or whether we will live up to our ideas of equality and equal justice before the law. Spivak, Dr. King, I'd like to come back to you now. The superintendent of police of Chicago, Mr. O.W. Wilson, said the other day that your civil rights tactics have aroused hatred among Chicago white residents and are hampering the Negro's progress. What's your answer to that? King, well, my answer is that this is totally erroneous. Our civil rights efforts have not aroused hatred. They have revealed a hatred that already existed. There is no doubt about the fact that there are many latent hostilities existing within certain white groups in the North, and that has happened now is these latent hostilities have come out in the open. And I don't think you can blame the civil rights movement for that. Certainly, no one would blame the physician for using his instruments and his skills and his know-how to reveal to a patient that he has cancer. Indeed, one would praise a physician for having the wisdom and the judgment and the power to do that. Now we have only revealed in Chicago that there is a blatant social hate-filled cancer, and we haven't said even that it's an external state. We feel that it's curable, that it can be cured, but there is no doubt about the fact that the hate is here. We didn't create it, we merely exposed it and brought it to the surface. Spivak, Dr. King, I'm sure you either heard or read President Johnson's speech yesterday when he warned that violence and discord would destroy Negro hopes for rational or racial progress. Now, isn't it time to stop demonstrations that create violence and discord? King, well, I absolutely disagree with that, and I hope the president didn't mean to equate nonviolent demonstrations with a riot. And I think it is time for this country to use the distinction between the two. There is a great distinction between individuals who are nonviolently engaged in pursuit of basic constitutional rights and who in the process face violence and face hatred perpetrated against them, and individuals who aggressively throw Molotov cocktails and engage in riots. So that there can be no question, or there can be no identity between riots and demonstrations. I think demonstrations must continue, but I think riots must end because they are socially disruptive. I think they are self-defeating, and I think they can destroy the many creative steps that we have made in a forward sense over the last few years. Rowan, Mr. Wilkins, despite the fact that you gentlemen sit here together, there is a feeling around the country that there's a crisis of leadership in the civil rights movement. Do you agree that the movement toward Negro equality is jeopardized by what now seems to be a host of warring civil rights groups, each pursuing its own special interests? Wilkins. No, Mr. Owen, I don't think it's quite that serious. We tend to feel that unity should be exhibited at all times, no matter what kind of organizations or what kind of personalities or what kind of tactics are involved. I think we have to grow up to the idea that there will be differences of opinion and that these will manifest themselves from time to time. I don't see as yet any great split in the civil rights movement. Rowan. Well, I noticed in the New York Times, Mr. Wilkins, a quotation from a so called SNCC position paper saying we are now aware that the NAACP has grown reactionary, is controlled by the black power structure itself, and holds and stands as one of the main roadblocks to black freedom. I know also that an NAACP official was referring to the National Urban League as an Uncle Tom organization. Now, this you don't think is a serious division or anything to be worried about? Wilkins. No, no. I call your attention, first of all, to the fact that the SNCC person said that we were, the NAACP, was controlled by the Black Power structure. Rowan. I wondered if that was a typo. Wilkins. No, it wasn't a typographical error. And for that, we moved up on the scale because there was a time when the spokesman would have said that we were controlled by the white power structure. But the NAAC official you referred to as calling the Urban League Uncle Tom was only a local official, an extremely individualistic one at that, and in no sense can be said to represent the sentiment of the NAACP. Rowan. Well, now, I note, Mr. Wilkins, that your organization lost some 15,000 members between 1964 and 1965. Now, you don't think the NAACP and the country are in trouble today because the NAACP put its faith in the law and court decisions, but that when the crunch came to the decisions were not enforced and the laws became just so much paper? Wilkins. No, I don't think we're in trouble because the lost 15,000 members out of a 500,000. I don't think I don't consider that serious or beyond accounting for in the normal course of events. Nor do I believe that the adherence to law and order is a penalty that we suffer. I think we all have come back to law and order. I understand Dr. King out in Chicago has a lawyer now working on his injunction business. And I see where SNCC is engaging lawyers up in Philadelphia. So we all come to the courtroom and to the law eventually. We find that we can't solve it with rhetoric. Kilpatrick. Dr. King, you have been quoted as saying that you have encountered more hatred among white opponents in Chicago than you encountered in the Deep South. How do you account for that? King, well, I think for years the hatred existed beneath the surface in northern communities, and I said earlier it's coming out now. I think also we have to see that this is something of a dislike for the unlike, and you see it a great deal among the lower income ethnic enclaves who have basic fears about Negroes. They have grown up believing in certain stereotypes, whether it's the stereotype of the Negroes are lazy or inherently inferior, or whether it is a myth that Negroes depreciate property values when they move in a community. There is another fear, the fear that the Negro is an economic threat. Now, I think all of these things have contributed to, and in a sense, have conjured to bring about this massive outpouring of hatred in Chicago, and I'm sure in other communities. Kilpatrick. But why should these factors carry greater weight in Chicago or in some other northern city than they would in the Deep South? King. Well, I'm not saying I haven't said they exist more than they do in the Deep South, because I must make one distinction, and that is in the South we have had the hatred, the violence, the vitriolic and vituperative words of the mobs on one hand, but often those mobs have been aided and abetted by the law and by enforcement agents. I think the difference is here that we have the violence of the mobs, but at least the law enforcement agents are trying to preserve a degree of law and order. In the South, we had a double blow. We've had the mob against us, as well as, in some instances, law enforcement agents actually and literally supporting the mob in the North. It's often the mob and the support, on the other hand, of the policemen trying to restrain the mob. But I don't say that the hatred is worse. I think it's equal, and I think we've got to see now that the problem is a national problem and that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to remove these conditions and the kind of hatred that we see both North and South today. But yeah, I think I'll go ahead and end here. We'll finish it off in the next episode of this. But yeah, Dr. King in another and a number of other civil rights leaders are discussing uh, how things are looking, what is going on. A lot is being directed at King early because, as they said, he does have to leave. But notice how even here many refuse to separate nonviolent demonstrations with riots. Just as we had with the recent uh, George Floyd protests, I think about a year or so ago, because many people were like, all I see is a lot of looting, a lot of hatred, a lot of riots. But the fact was, it was only a small portion of them. And they were often um, denounced by the nonviolent members. So Dr. King even faced that kind of an issue. But as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.